Hey everyone, in this video we are going to talk about the anatomy of the heart. We're going to start with external anatomy and then we'll look at some of the internal structures of the heart. So what we didn't discuss in previous videos is the wall of the heart. So if we were to take a slice of the heart wall, we left off in the last video discussing the sac or the pericardium that encapsulates the heart. Where we left off, or the deepest or most internal structure of the pericardium was, if you remember, the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. Right? So the serous pericardium is the double layered sac that contains the heart, and the one closest to the heart wall is the visceral layer. So if we start there, our visceral layer is comprised of simple squamous epithelium, and then typically we have this layer of areolar connective tissue and fat. And as we age, we actually start to deposit more fat there. And this fat has a very important function in helping the heart do what it has to do. So why would you need fat anywhere in the body? Yeah, if you said for insulation and energy storage, you are correct. So while the heart is contracting and relaxing within the thoracic cavity, within that tough fibrous pericardium, it also needs a little bit of cushioning. So we have our layer of fat. Deeper to the epicardium, so we call this the epicardium. It includes both the visceral layer of the serous pericardium as well as the connective tissue deep to it. Deep to the epicardium is what's called the myocardium. So the myocardium is, is my stylus working? The myocardium, from the name myocardium, is comprised of muscle. And what type of muscle do we find here? You guessed it, cardiac muscle. So you have this thick layer of cardiac muscle, and then deeper to that is the, now over here, deep to the myocardium, we are in the endocardium. So 3 layers that comprise the wall of the heart. Number 1 is the epicardium. Number 2 is the myocardium. And number 3 is the endocardium. So if you remember lessons from chapter 4, where we talked about different types of tissues, we have typically where you are forming the wall of an organ or a barrier, that's where we find epithelial tissue, right? So inside of the heart, now if we were over here, we are literally inside of the chambers of the heart. And this is called the endocardium. Yes, you guessed it, it has a layer of epithelial tissue and then a layer of areolar connective tissue. And that specific type of epithelial tissue within the walls of the heart, lining the chambers of the heart, is called the endothelium. Okay, so we're going to talk about first external anatomy of the heart. And what you see here is a heart, obviously, right? And we want to be able to identify whether we're looking at an anterior view or posterior view. So typically, as we've done in the past, we look for landmarks. And as we discussed in the video on the position of the heart, you should remember that the heart is rotated so that the right side of the heart is more anterior than the left side of the heart. So if we start with the chambers of the heart, we have 4 chambers. We have the superior atria is plural or atrium is singular. We have a right atrium and a left atrium. And then the inferior chambers are the ventricles. So we have a right and left ventricle. And what you notice here is that the right side of the heart, or the right atrium and the right ventricle, is more visible than the left side. And our anatomical landmark for the right atrium is this ear-like flap called the auricle, right? So you see more of the right auricle than you do the left auricle right here. So they're kind of like ears that wrap around, and they're like these floppy ear-like structures. And in the anterior view of the heart, you see more of the right atrium. Okay, just inferior to the auricle of the right atrium is the coronary sulcus right here. Let me change my color so you can see that better. Okay, this right here is the coronary sulcus, and it separates the superior atria from the ventricles. So what it does is it actually wraps around the entire circumference of the heart. You can see the left side of it right here. So the coronary sulcus wraps itself around the heart, and that is our landmark for separating the atria from the ventricles. So right now we're just looking at external anatomy. Okay, within that coronary sulcus, you have blood vessels that both supply and drain blood from the heart, and that will be our next video, coronary circulation. So not only is the heart a pump which supplies oxygen-rich blood to the body, it is an organ itself that needs an oxygen supply. Right? So very important is coronary circulation, which supplies oxygen-rich blood to the heart itself. Okay, so we will talk about those in more detail in the next video. Okay, then we have, so what you have here, these structures, these are our great vessels. The great vessels are, they're called great because they're big and they're great. They're really important. They are what help blood or direct blood movement to and from the heart. So if we start from the right atrium, the two vessels that dump into the right atrium are called the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. You can see in this cartoon they're encoded in blue, so that denotes that they are carrying oxygen poor blood. Where would you be bringing oxygen poor blood from? Systemic circulation, right? So you are bringing back oxygen poor blood with high carbon dioxide and dumping it into the right atrium. So you have the superior and inferior vena cava dumping into the right atrium. And if you were in lab, unfortunately you are not, if you were in lab, the way you would identify these, they're really easy to identify, but it's really fun identifying these vessels, because how we identify them, a good anatomist looks at where something is coming from and where it's going to. So what you would do is you would take your probe or your finger and you would stick it into each blood vessel, each of the great vessels, and you would do your section and look at the internal structures and see kind of where your fingers end up in which chambers, right? So if you stuck your finger or your probe into the superior and inferior vena cava, they would meet together in the right atrium. Okay, the blood flow, so I have to talk about this in the context of blood flow because that's how it makes sense. So we're receiving deoxygenated blood in the right atrium. It then drains into, once the atrium is full, it goes into the right ventricle. And if we think about it, now that we have this oxygen poor blood, this deoxygenated blood, where do we want it to go? We want it to go back to the lungs to pick up more oxygen. So the right ventricle, when the heart contracts, the right ventricle then sends this blood through these vessels called the pulmonary arteries. Here is that exception where arteries are carrying deoxygenated blood. You have the pulmonary trunk here, and the left and right pulmonary arteries receiving blood from the right ventricle and sending it to the lungs. All right? If we go to the left side of the heart right here, so here is the apex of the heart. The left side of the heart is receiving oxygenated blood from the lungs. It's receiving oxygen-rich blood from the lungs through the pulmonary veins. You have your right and left pulmonary veins bringing blood from the lungs to the left atrium. And I'm going to make a star right here because this auricle is what tells me that this is the left atrium. The left atrium fills up with oxygen-rich blood, and then it goes into the left ventricle, and the left ventricle is then going to pump that oxygen-rich blood to where? To the body. The vessel that does this, you've all heard of it before, this really large vessel, the aorta. So this is what's called the aortic arch. We have the ascending aorta and the descending aorta, and that's going to carry oxygen-rich blood to the rest of the body. Okay, so we discussed that if you want to look for a landmark that separates, let me erase some of these marks here. If you want to find a landmark that separates your atria from your ventricles, it would be this one right here, right? That is our external landmark that separates atria and ventricles. It's called the coronary sulcus. If we want to look for a landmark that's going to separate right ventricle from left ventricle, I meant to right from left, it is this structure right here. This is the interventricular sulcus, and we have two of them. We have an anterior one. If we have an anterior one, we obviously have a posterior one. Another important structure we have here is the ligamentum arteriosum. So this is actually a remnant of a fetal structure called the ductus arteriosum, which in the developing fetus functions to shunt blood from the pulmonary arteries through the aorta. Now, why would you want to do that in a fetus? Because the lungs are not yet functional until birth, right? So this structure actually is fully formed about 3 weeks after birth, and it attaches on the superior side of the pulmonary trunk to the aortic arch. If we look at the cadaver image, you can see that the structures look very similar as the stylized cartoon. So this is one of the things that I really like about cardiovascular, I will say it, anatomy. I actually really do enjoy cardiovascular anatomy, anatomy of the heart, because it makes sense. It is something we are all familiar with in that we all inhale oxygen, exhale carbon dioxide, and we all kind of have an idea of what the purpose of this is. So when we look at the stylized cartoons in our textbook, typically it's pretty easy to identify certain structures, and then we go to the cadaver or we go to the images in the lab manual, and it's like, oh, I don't know what I'm looking at. But if you look at this, this specimen, this image of the specimen, you should be able to, number one, tell me that we're looking at an anterior view. Okay, you should be able to see these flap-like, ear-like structures that tell you this is where my atria are. You should be able to now see that because we see more of this side, right? Here is your one auricle, here is your other auricle. We only see a little bit of this one, and that should tell you this is the left one and this is the right one, right? And then you have this groove, this deep groove in between your right atrium and your right ventricle. That is your coronary sulcus. And you should be able to realize that this coronary sulcus is going to go all the way around the heart to the left side, all right? And you should be able to find it there. Now that you've identified your right atrium and your right ventricle, you should be able to see these large structures here, right? You have arteries and veins delivering and draining blood in between the right atrium and, the right ventricle and the left ventricle, and that is your interventricular sulcus, right? It means it's in between the ventricles. It is a groove. We heard this word sulcus when we talked about the brain. So here in the heart, we have an anterior interventricular sulcus, and then if we look at a posterior view, ta-da! You have a posterior interventricular sulcus, and that is going to separate, now that you've rotated the heart and we're looking at a posterior view, your posterior interventricular sulcus is going to separate your right ventricle from your left ventricle. Okay, here is the aortic arch, and now you're getting into the descending aorta on the posterior side. The pulmonary veins are actually paired on each side. So you have this pair of pulmonary veins carrying oxygen-rich blood to the heart, right? Because veins carry blood to the heart while arteries carry it away. So oxygen-rich versus oxygen-poor is not the best way to remember this stuff, okay? Here, we said that we have our coronary sulcus that circumvents the heart. Here it is on the posterior side, right? And you have these blood vessels wrapping around the heart, and you have this nice big structure here, this big blood vessel called the coronary sinus. And if you remember blood flow, we talked about sinuses in the brain. Their function is to drain blood from a particular organ. Here we have the coronary sinus that drains blood from the heart, drains deoxygenated blood from the heart and dumps it into, can you guess? It's going to dump it into the right atrium. So the right atrium right here, superior to the right ventricle, separated by the coronary sulcus, is going to receive oxygen-poor blood, both from the inferior and superior vena cava, so the vena cava, and then from the coronary sinus. If we look at a posterior view in the specimen, again, it is a lot easier to identify certain structures in the heart than it is in other places in the body, right? So you have your right ventricle here separated from, separated from the left ventricle by the posterior. We are posterior, and it is the sulcus that separates right and left. Posterior interventricular sulcus, right? You have, now that you have identified right ventricle, we have a structure that separates atria. Sorry, left, I wrote an A instead of an L. Erase that. Okay, so we have left atrium and right atrium, and you can see, you should be able to identify this blood vessel going, huge blood vessel going superiorly into the right atrium. That would be your inferior vena cava. On the left side, here is where we form the base of the heart. So far you have seen, we've identified the apex of the heart, right? Even though it's the inferior structure, it's called the apex because it's kind of conical like this. It ends in a point, right? Here is the base of the heart, right? And it's formed mostly by the left atrium. Okay, we mentioned that blood flow through the heart is unidirectional, and there are these really important structures, internal structures, that allow for unidirectional blood flow through the heart. So they are called valves. The heart has 4 valves, and we will take a closer look at them. But if you have ever taken a stethoscope and auscultated or listened to heart sounds, typical heart sounds, we say they sound like lubbed up, lubbed up, lubbed up. So the first sound is what we hear. That is, the sounds are the closure of the valves. That's what you are hearing when you hear a heartbeat. Even if you put your ear up against someone's chest, you will be able to hear heart sounds, right? Those heart sounds are generated by the closing of valves. So the first sound is the closure of the atrioventricular valves. There are 2, and we call them AV valves. AV, or atrioventricular, means they are between the atria and the ventricles. And then we have 2 semilunar valves that are at the base of the great arteries that are carrying blood away from the heart. Right? So you fill your ventricles, okay? Don't get overwhelmed by all of the structures labeled here. Let's just think about this rationally and logically, what we know about blood flow, right? So we fill the atria first. We receive blood on the right side. We receive deoxygenated blood from the systemic circulation. And on the left side of the heart, or in the left atrium, we're receiving oxygenated blood from pulmonary circulation. Okay, so we fill the atria, and then when the atrium is full, as it's filling, it passes through, I need yellow here, yellow. It passes through this set of valves here. We have 2 atrioventricular valves. The one on the right side is called the right atrioventricular valve. It's also called the tricuspid valve. It's also called the tricuspid valve because it has 3 cusps. And then we have the left atrioventricular valve, also called the bicuspid valve. So what these valves are one-way valves that when you continuously fill the ventricles, they then, once the ventricles are full, they flap up and shut the passageway between the atria and the ventricles, so that when you contract the ventricles and generate that force to push blood out of the ventricles and into the, on the right side, into the pulmonary arteries, and on the left side, into the aorta, you don't want blood flowing back into the atria. All right, so the atrioventricular valves are what prevent blood flow, backflow into the atria. So what they are comprised of is this, so what you have are the right right AV valve or the tricuspid valve and the left AV valve or the bicuspid. The bicuspid valve is also sometimes referred to as the mitral valve. And now I'm going backwards. Okay, need my pen. Here we go, pen. Okay, so the left AV valve is sometimes called, or in clinical settings, it's actually called the mitral valve. Okay, and the way they close is they have these flaps here. So the flaps close up, and then you have these strings here called chordae tendineae. If you've ever heard the saying, you're playing on my heartstrings, all right, in old country music songs, those heartstrings are the chordae tendineae, and what attaches the chordae tendineae to the wall of the heart is this structure right here called the papillary muscle. Now, if we look at some internal structures of the right atrium right here, first of all, before we get into internal structures, if we were actually, let's quickly look at the specimen photo. All right, so still looks pretty similar to the cartoon, maybe not upon first glance, and if we had one in front of us, then we would really be able to explore this, and hopefully one day you will, especially if you're going to nursing school or medical school, right? My future anesthesiologists in the room, you will be looking at this. So one way that we can differentiate right and left side by looking at internal anatomy is what? What major difference do you see by looking at this specimen? Maybe it's something that you are aware of already, that the left side of the heart does something while the right side of the heart does something else. The left side of the heart is going to pump oxygen-rich blood to the entire body, right? So that's really, really important. So the left side of the heart, right? Form follows function. If we think about form following function in the anatomy of the heart, we see this very, very clearly in looking at the wall or the myocardium of the left ventricle versus the right ventricle. So if you were in lab, what you would do is you would stick your finger or your probe or whatever until you feel that smooth surface of endothelium, and that way you know you are inside of the chamber of the heart, and then you look at the thickness of the myocardium. The left side of the heart has a much, much thicker myocardium than the right side of the heart, because think about blood pressure. We have two blood pressures. We have a systolic blood pressure and a diastolic blood pressure. That systolic, or that higher number, is due to the force generated by the contraction of the heart, and you are contracting, although you're contracting both ventricles at the same time, right? That left ventricle is the one sending blood through the aorta to the whole body, and that is what we are. Put your finger right here. Put your fingers right here on the side of your neck. You should be able to feel your carotid pulse right here. All right, so that is the force generated from that left side of the heart. So major anatomical difference internally between left and right side is that much thicker myocardium in the left ventricle. Okay, where were we? Hello. Okay, so internal structures. Even in the cartoon, you can see, right, left side of the heart has a much thicker myocardium than the right side of the heart. Now, the structure that separates right and left side between ventricles is going to be called, surprise, surprise, the interventricular septum, right? A septum is a fence or something that separates. So you have your interventricular septum separating right and left ventricles. And then if we go up to the atria, we have a interatrial septum right here. So the interatrial septum is what separates right and left atria. Within the right atrium, so the right atrium has a few structures that are pretty important. This structure right here is called the fossa ovalis. It is also, like the ligamentum arteriosum, it is a vestige of an embryonic structure. In the embryo, in the developing fetus, it used to be called a foramen ovalis. So it was an actual hole that shunted blood between the right and left atria. In the adult, it's called the fossa ovalis because it's not quite a hole. Okay, just another couple of really important structures. We're on the topic of valves. So we have our two AV valves, and then we have our semilunar valves. Okay, the semilunar valves are also going to function to do what? Unidirectional blood flow. So heart contracts, blood leaves both ventricles. On the left side of the heart, we are leaving the left ventricle through the aorta. And then on the right side of the heart, we are leaving the ventricles through the pulmonary arteries, right? Pulmonary arteries carrying deoxygenated blood away from the heart. So in order to prevent backflow, right, is these semilunar valves. So in the pulmonary trunk, you have the pulmonary semilunar valve, and then it's not shown here, but we will see it in a later figure. Here is your specimen. In the aorta, you have the aortic semilunar valve. So a pulmonary semilunar valve and aortic semilunar valve are valves at the base of those greater vessels that when you have contraction of the ventricles, it prevents backflow. The AV valves, or the tricuspid and bicuspid valves. So you can see that where those names came from, right? Here you have your three cusps on the right side, and then on the left side you have your bicuspid or mitral valve. And the next slide is an interesting fun fact about where the name mitral came from. So because it looks like the bishop's mitre, right? Kind of looks like a mitre right here, so that's why it's called the mitral valve. And in clinical settings, you are more likely to hear it be called the mitral valve. Okay, so that is it for internal anatomy of the heart. One last thing that we should be aware of is that there is this structure, it's not a thing, it's a structure, right, called the fibrous skeleton, and it's what allows the heart, because again, it's contracting and relaxing, right? We use our fibrous pericardium to keep it from bouncing around in the thoracic cavity, but we also want to make sure that it doesn't collapse upon itself. So what you have is this fibrous skeleton made of dense, regular connective tissue that sits in between the atria and ventricles and helps maintain this rigid structure as well as an electrical insulator. So later on we will be talking about conduction system of the heart. You will learn a lot more about it in physiology, but we're briefly going to talk about the cardiac cycle in this lesson. So that's it for anatomy of the heart. Know your external structures, figure out your landmarks, whether you are anterior or posterior. What are the structures that separate the atria from the ventricles? What are the structures that externally separate the ventricles right and left? And how can you identify the great vessels? Where are they coming from and where are they going to? And then when we get into the internal anatomy, I want you to know your AV valves, your semilunar valves, and some of the main structures that I talked about previously in that slide. Okay, good luck. Be well, study well, and look out for the next video.